In the year 1513, an Ottoman admiral sat down and drew a map. Near the bottom edge, he sketched a coastline that curves and stretches in a way that some people insist shouldn't have been possible. 300 years would pass before anyone confirmed what was actually down there. And according to a small group of researchers, what was down there had been buried under ice for thousands of years before that. This is the story of a 500-year-old document that still refuses to stay quiet. A map some call proof of forgotten knowledge. A map others call the most misunderstood object in the history of cartography. By the end of this video, you will have to decide which version unsettles you more. The map is called the Piri Reis map. Today it survives as a single torn fragment, sealed behind glass in a palace in Istanbul. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. But for nearly a century, this fragment has pulled historians, cartographers, and curious minds into the same argument. Somewhere in its faded ink is a question that will not go away. How much of our past has actually been lost? And how much of that loss have we only just begun to notice? The story starts not in the age of exploration, but in 1929 inside the Topkapi palace. The Ottoman Empire was gone. Turkey was a new republic, and historians were going through the old imperial archives, room by room, document by document. Most of what they found was administrative. Tax records, court letters, the dry paperwork of an empire. Then, in a stack of forgotten material, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann found something different. A piece of gazelle skin parchment, roughly the size of a placemat, covered in hand-drawn coastlines and notes written in Ottoman Turkish. It was dated to the year 1513. At first glance, it looked like any other old nautical chart. Spain, West Africa, the coast of South America, all rendered with surprising confidence for an era when most of the world was still being guessed at. But the deeper scholars looked, the stranger the map became. Because the man who drew it had never sailed to most of these places himself. That admission alone should have been the end of the story. Instead, it was only the beginning. The map's creator was Piri Reis, a name that translates simply as Captain Piri. He was not a fantasist or a mystic. He was a career naval officer, a cartographer, and for a time a pirate working under his uncle Kemal Reis, one of the most feared commanders in the Mediterranean. Piri Reis spent decades at sea. He fought in real battles, charted real coastlines, and eventually rose to command the entire Ottoman fleet in the Indian Ocean. He also wrote one of the most detailed sailing guides of his century, the Kitabi Bahriye, a manual so accurate that sailors used it for generations after his death. This matters, because it tells us something important. Piri Reis was not guessing wildly or inventing fantasy geography. He was a professional. And on the edges of his 1513 map, in careful handwritten notes, he left something almost no other mapmaker of his time bothered to include. He told us exactly where his information came from. He wrote that he had compiled the map from around 20 older charts, some reaching back to the time of Alexander the Great, including a map he claimed once belonged to Christopher Columbus himself. Whether that specific claim is true is impossible to confirm today. The Columbus map he refers to has never been found, but the method he describes, gathering and combining older surviving sources, is exactly how serious cartography worked in that era, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Piri Reis was simply copying older maps, where did those older maps get their information? And just how old does the trail go? For decades, the Piri Reis map sat quietly in academic discussion as a curious but minor historical artifact. Then in 1956, a Turkish naval officer sent a copy of it to the United States Navy Hydrographic Office. What came back from that office is where the real controversy begins. Captain Arlington Mallory, a cartographer who had spent years studying old maps, looked closely at the southern edge of the chart. Most historians had assumed this lower section was simply an extension of the South American coast, drawn with the usual exaggeration and guesswork mapmakers used when they ran out of real information. Mallory disagreed. He argued the coastline bent and folded in a way that matched the shape of Antarctica's Queen Maud Land coast. Not the icy, frozen coastline explorers found in the 20th century, but the rock and land beneath that ice, a coastline officially confirmed only through seismic surveys done in 1949. If he was right, that left an unsettling problem. Antarctica was not discovered by Europeans until 1820. The ice covering its coastline is thought to be thousands of years old. So how could a map drawn in 1513, supposedly using sources far older than that, show a version of the coast as it looked before the ice took over? This is the moment the Piri Reis map stopped being a footnote in cartography and became one of the most argued over documents in the world. In the 1960s, a college professor named Charles Hapgood decided to test the claim properly. He brought it to his students at Keene State College and worked through the coastline measurements with mathematicians and surveyors, including input from an officer at the Air Force's cartographic unit. Hapgood became convinced the southern landmass on the map was, in fact, Antarctica, mapped before its ice sheet fully formed. In 1966, he published his theory in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. His argument was bold, and to many scientists, deeply troubling. He proposed that an advanced ancient civilization, lost to history, had mapped the entire globe with precision tools long before the rise of Egypt, Greece or Rome. He suggested their knowledge survived only in fragments, copied and recopied by later cultures who no longer understood what they were preserving. This is, without question, a theory, not an accepted scientific conclusion. Hapgood had real academic credentials, and his measurements were detailed. But the leap from interesting coastline overlap to an entire lost civilization with global seafaring capability is enormous. Mainstream historians and cartographers have pushed back hard against it for decades, but the theory found an audience far beyond academic journals. Books, documentaries, and eventually the internet kept the idea alive, long after most professional historians had moved on. To be fair to the other side of this argument, most cartographic historians do not buy the Antarctica theory at all. They argue that the southern section of the Piri Reis map is simply a distorted, exaggerated continuation of the South American coastline, bent downward and to the right by the flat projection method common in that era. Mapmakers of the time often filled unknown regions with rough extensions of known coastlines, sometimes adding imagined islands or features to avoid leaving blank space. Under this explanation, the apparent match to Antarctica is closer to pattern recognition than genuine cartographic accuracy. The human brain is remarkably good at finding shapes that feel familiar, even in random or distorted lines. Critics point out that overlay comparisons between the map and modern Antarctic coastlines require selective rotation and stretching to align. Both sides of this debate have something true buried inside them. Piri Reis was a careful, professional cartographer who explicitly explained he used older source maps. That part is documented fact. Whether one of those ancient sources somehow preserved a pre-Ice Age view of Antarctica is and remains an unproven and contested theory. What nobody disputes is the part that should unsettle you the most. Piri Reis told us, in his own handwriting, that his map was built from roughly 20 older charts. Almost none of those original sources survive today. Not the Columbus map he described, not the ancient charts he says dated back to the era of Alexander the Great. They are gone, the way so much of the ancient world's written knowledge is gone. History is full of these disappearances. The Library of Alexandria, by legend, once held the largest collection of recorded knowledge in the ancient world before it was lost to fire, war, and the slow neglect of empires that no longer valued what it held. We will likely never know exactly what was destroyed or what insight, navigational or otherwise, vanished with it. This is the real, documented, disturbing truth at the center of this story. It is not about ancient aliens or a hidden master civilization. It is about how casually human history allows knowledge to disappear. Wars burn libraries. Conquerors erase the records of the conquered. Empires rise, decide which knowledge matters, and let the rest rot in storerooms until it is gone. Piri Reis himself is proof of this pattern. He preserved fragments of older maps that would otherwise have vanished completely, and even then, the originals he copied from did not survive. So when people argue today over whether his map shows Antarctica before the ice, they are really circling a much bigger and far more certain truth. We do not have anywhere close to a complete record of what ancient people knew, built, sailed, or mapped. We only have what survived the fires, the floods, the conquests, and the centuries of indifference. The Piri Reis map is one of the rare pieces that made it through, and that alone should make you wonder what didn't. Maybe the southern coastline on that fragile sheet of gazelle skin really is a memory of Antarctica before the ice closed over it. Maybe it is nothing more than a careful guess that happened to bend in the right direction. We may never know for certain, but every time historians find a fragment like this, half preserved, half destroyed, it is worth remembering that the past is not a finished book sitting quietly on a shelf. It is a burned library with a handful of surviving pages, and we are still trying to read between the ashes. If you want more stories from humanity's forgotten past, subscribe to Mythic Origins.